Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. Now, this is a collection of short stories that was first published in the UK in 2005, but it wasn't published in the US until 2007. Now, this was Joe Hill's debut book, and he would go on to write books like Horns, Heart-Shaped Box, Nosferatu, The Fireman, and he wrote the comic book series Lock and Key. Now, Joe Hill's real name is Joe King, and he's the son of popular author Stephen King. Now, before I get into the individual stories in this book, I gotta say that 20th Century Ghost was a damn good collection with some really top-notch stories. Now, this collection features the short story The Black Phone, which was recently adapted into the 2022 horror drama film of the same name, which was a brilliant movie. Now, recent editions of this book have actually been retitled The Black Phone in order to tie in more with the movie. Now, in this video, I'll be discussing each individual story in the collection. So, the first story contained in the collection is called Best New Horror. Now, this one I actually read about a year ago, and you'll have to forgive me, I didn't reread it in preparation for this review, so please forgive me if my memory's a little fuzzy on this story, but this was actually a really good story. Basically, the story is about this guy who edits this horror anthology called Best New Horror, where they publish stories from up-and-coming horror writers, but he's kind of disillusioned with his job and with the horror genre in general. Like, a lot of the stuff he's publishing really isn't very good. But what happens is he gets this one story submitted to him, not from the author himself, but from a college professor who previously published the story in a literary magazine at his college, and because of this story, he actually lost his position at this college. The story itself was written by apparently one of the janitors at the college, and the main character admits that it's not the most well-written story in the world, but there's something about the sheer brutality of the story that really attracts him to it, and in the story, the main character becomes obsessed with tracking down the author of this story, but he might not like where his quest leads him. What I thought was interesting about this story is it works as a solid horror story, while also being sort of a thesis on the genre itself. And the story is a commentary both on horror fandom and on how the genre itself is very much looked down upon by the mainstream. Like, there are a lot of people who say things like, oh, horror novels, horror stories, that's not really writing, that's not really literature, or horror movies, that's not really cinema, and to me that is such a close-minded and stupid mindset. But at the same time, the main character of the story seems to have a very mixed view on the genre himself, because at a certain point he's given a lecture at this writers' convention and he's talking about how the genre of horror deserves just as much credit as any other literary genre, which is true, but in the same sentence he also says most horror is crap and good horror is very rare, so it's like, are you a horror fan or are you not? But I feel like that duality is relevant to a lot of horror fans. Like, I remember watching a review of Pumpkinhead, which was actually a really good review where the guy was going into all these deeper themes in the film, but then he said, okay, I know we're just talking about a horror movie, as if being a horror movie automatically cancels out there being any sort of deeper or intellectual analysis. Like, horror, I do think, is probably the most disrespected genre, even within its own fan base, and in a lot of ways this story is kind of talking about that, while also being a good horror story on its own. Now, for the next section of this video, I'll be discussing the short story 20th Century Ghosts with my friend Jeremy. Hey guys, so for this section of the video, I'm discussing the short story 20th Century Ghosts which is what the entire collection is basically named after. And I'm joined by my friend Jeremy. So what do you think of this story?
It's a pretty good story. The atmosphere was pretty good, perfectly creepy, and it just had a sense of dread about it, which I liked.
Now, the story is about this movie theater that is haunted by the ghost of a young woman who was murdered during a screening of The Wizard of Oz. And over the course of several decades, she's revealed herself to different patrons at this theater. But the main character of the story is this man named Alex, who is the manager of the theater, who first encountered her when he was a child, actually during a screening of Fantasia that he snuck into shortly after the death of his brother. But it turns out this theater might be closing soon, and his biggest fear is what's going to happen to this woman when the theater closes. It is a creepy story, but there's also something kind of sad and melancholy about it too. Because you do kind of feel sorry for the ghost in the story. She was this innocent woman who was murdered and was also a big movie fan, and I love the concept of a ghost that just throughout the decades sees all these different movies.
Yeah, that is a very interesting idea.
But what I really liked about this is it really felt like a love letter to cinema. It felt like a love letter to movies, and I also felt like the ghost in the story was kind of a metaphor for how, in a weird way, when you're watching a movie, you almost are watching ghosts, especially if you're watching an older movie where most of those actors are dead. But even a modern movie, when you watch it, we're all gonna die eventually, but those actors, it's almost like their images are immortalized in a way as ghosts. Movies, in a weird way, almost are like man-made ghosts. They're reflections or images or shadows of things that once were.
Yeah, it's a good story, and you feel sorry for the ghost, but you also do feel uncomfortable when the story says that she starts talking to people and, bleeding, so there's that. And, I also found it cool that the owner of the theater was friends with this famous director.
Yeah, there's a character in the short story who is quite clearly a stand-in for Steven Spielberg. Yes. Yeah, and I like the idea that almost everybody that this ghost appeared to ended up getting jobs in movies or something involved in the media. I thought that was really cool. Again, the whole story just feels like this great love letter to movies. And while it is a horror story, it's also kind of a bittersweet story as well. And the ending, the ending's both creepy, but also kind of sad, but also in a weird way, kind of uplifting as well.
I suppose so.
So any closing thoughts on 20th Century Ghosts?
It's a good story. Go check it out.
So now we're on to the third story in the collection, and for this section of the video, I'm joined by my friend Chris Polano.
Hey guys.
And the story we're reviewing is Pop Art. This was a really interesting one. The best way I could describe it is it seems to be an example of magical realism, which is a subgenre of fantasy where it's fantastical things happening in a relatively realistic universe. The characters within the story don't realize it's magic, it seems to just be a normal thing in this story's universe, but basically the story follows a kid who's best friends with this boy named Art. But Art is not a normal human boy. He's actually an inflatable human.
Yeah, they actually talked about it as being an actual medical condition that other people do have. It's extremely rare. There are other people that have it.
Essentially, it's some kind of condition where you're more or less like a living human balloon. Yeah. It's actually, while the premise might seem ridiculous, it's actually a really sad and moving story. Yeah. What do you think of Pop Art?
I thought it was great. I thought, in a way, it was kind of like Stephen King's Elevation.
Okay. I haven't read Elevation, so I don't know.
But yeah, so in a way, it's kind of like that. In a funny aspect, I also kind of pictured it kind of like that SpongeBob episode of Bubble Boy.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought it was sad because, this character, Art, he's inflatable and he always talks to his best friend. Well, he always writes down to his best friend about death because that's always on his mind. And it's It's like he's not always sad about it. He always just pictures it and it's not if the time comes for him, it's when the time will come from him.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting conversations in this book about religion and the afterlife, which I thought was really cool, especially for a story, again, about a living balloon boy. Yeah. It's actually a really deep story, and there's also what sort of, I don't know if you picked up on this, but I almost got a sense that Art, the character of Art, he's from a Jewish family, and there's almost this, you could almost look at the prejudice that he faces as almost a metaphor for anti-Semitism. I don't know if that's what Joe Hill was going for, but I thought that was something I kind of picked up on.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but yeah, that's definitely something that could be true.
But yeah, it's a really, really sad story. And what do you think of the main character, like the Art's best friend in the story?
Well, as talked about in the book, he's more of a loner kid who doesn't really want to be friends with anybody. He just tries to stick to himself, tries to be that loner with like a knife, kind of like...
Yeah, he's kind of like a troubled kid. Like, he's the kind of character who, like, if Joe Hill's father were writing this book, would probably be a bully or a villain in it. But here he's actually a pretty awesome character.
Because, he tries to stay away from everybody, but then when he sees that this character, Art, is being bullied, he tries to stick up for him. And he's like, he knows what this kid is kind of going through different things.
Yeah. And the ending is absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Which, in the ending, is sort of built up throughout the story, because it's all being narrated by the main character, and he talks about how it doesn't end well.
No.
So throughout it, you get this, like, almost sense of gloom throughout it. Like, this is all building up to something really bad. And again, it's a surprisingly moving and sad story for, again, a story about a fucking living balloon.
Now, this story was adapted into a short film.
Very good story. I cannot recommend it enough.
Yeah.
So, for this section of the video, I'm discussing the short story You'll Hear the Locust Sing with my friend, college professor William Burns.
Hello, everyone.
And basically, this story, it's about this weird kid who wakes up one morning to find that he's been transformed into a giant locust. It's basically a take on the Franz Kafka short story, The Metamorphosis, but also takes a lot of elements from B-movies of the 1950s. So what do you think of this story?
I enjoyed it. I thought it was a very interesting story. I would agree with you. I think it takes sort of the bare kind of plot points from the Metamorphosis and uses them, but there's a lot of where it sort of goes its own way. I mean, I love the Metamorphosis. I think it's actually probably my favorite piece of literature, but it's interesting that in the Metamorphosis, the Metamorphosis, first of all, it's pretty much, you get the sense that the Metamorphosis is only in Gregor Samsa, the character's head. Where I guess in the story, in the Joe Hill story, the Metamorphosis is real. It actually has happened in reality. Do you agree with that?
Actually, I read the story twice, and when I first read it, I interpreted it literally, and I read it more straightforwardly, but when I read it a second time, because basically in the story, this kid, when he turns into this giant locust, he ends up killing his father, and I forgot whether he kills his stepmother or just traumatizes her.
I think he just traumatizes her, from what I remember.
Yeah, and then at the very end of the story, he ends up going to his school and killing a bunch of students at his school. When I first read it, I interpreted it literally. Reading it the second time, I think this is kind of a metaphor for a school shooting.
Okay.
But I mean, maybe I'm just reaching way deeper than was actually intended, but that's kind of the subtext I'm getting from the story.
That's interesting, because now the more I think about it, what you said, then maybe it does have more to do with the Metamorphosis, right? Because in the original Metamorphosis, Gregor imagines that he's this beetle because he has all these responsibilities on his back and he sees no way out of it. So I think as a psychological defense, he imagines himself as this beetle, right? As this insect. And obviously, if you're an insect, you can't go to work anymore. You can't support your family. You actually are liberated in some ways, right? You gain that freedom, which he didn't have because he had to work for his parents. He was locked into this job he hated. His father, kind of faked being sick and to retire. His mother didn't work, so he had to have all those burdens on his back. And obviously he didn't want to disappoint his parents, right? That's something that's frowned upon in culture, right? Is that, your parents took care of you, you should take care of your parents. So he really saw no way out. So a lot of the interpretations are that he actually imagines that he does. It's the only way he could get out from under these pressures is that he transforms into this beetle, right? But again, in the story, if you read the story very closely, you'll see that there are sort of inconsistencies, and there's actually one point where to make more money, because Gregor's not working anymore, they actually hire out one of the rooms to like these lodgers who come in. And at one point, the lodgers actually see Gregor. Gregor actually comes out of his room, and you think on one hand, if you saw this giant insect come out, you'd freak out, you'd run out, and they kind of like smirk and look down at him and make faces, indicating that like, what, this guy's nuts, So that's where I was thinking about that. But if you think about if Joe Hill's story is about a kid who is picked on, who lives this life where he sees no future, maybe that is a way to liberate himself mentally, right? Because again, this idea of in our society, right, we're not supposed to attack our parents. We're not supposed to have anger at them. We're not supposed to attack authority figures like teachers. So maybe this is a way that he does allow himself to be liberated. But I guess the one thing I would worry about that, because in Kafka's story, he has like no friends. Right? I mean, the only friend he has is a picture that he cuts out of a magazine that he sort of stares at and looks at. Yet in this story, he does have a friend, right? And the friend seems to be pretty understanding of him in some ways.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the first person he kills, I think.
Yes, I believe so.
Right? So,
actually, no, I think he kills his father.
Right. I mean, in the store. I mean, in the school.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So and again, there is a history in literature of the idea of transforming into an animal as freedom, right? There's Ovid's The Metamorphosis, right? About this idea that we're so trapped in our human bodies, we see everything just through a human's perspective. If we can gain a different perspective, we'll not only learn something about the world, but about ourselves, right? And that's what happens in Ovid's Metamorphosis, right? That different people get transformed into different animals, and all of a sudden they kind of understand the world a little bit better because they're seeing it from a different perspective. And then they understand themselves a little bit more because, again, having this experience of looking through someone else's eyes or seeing the world through a different perspective, you gain sort of wisdom from that, right? So maybe that's, and here it's obviously very self-destructive in a way, right? I mean, again, these fantasies that he has of these, quite violent fantasies, And it's interesting that the only attention he really got from his peer group was his ability to eat insects, right? He sort of eats insects. So it's interesting that sort of he takes that, if he is imagining this, that he takes that that appearance on. Although there is also the reason I thought it was literal, because they do take time to talk about these experiments that are going on, right? The government's doing these experiments out in the desert, right? And so you get this feeling that sort of something wrong has happened, and it has poisoned the air or the water or the soil or something, right? There's something going on in this town. It actually kind of reminded me a little bit of The Mist. Where it's kind of, you have this sort of vague understanding that the government are doing something weird and something has been released. So I guess that's why I saw it as being literal, because of that backstory.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like in the original Metamorphosis, there's no backstory that, the Czech scientists are doing these experiments in Prague, and maybe Gregor breathed in, you know what I mean? Like, you don't get that at all in the original story, where here you do get this sort of, maybe it is literal. But I think your take is very interesting.
And that's something I do like about the stories, that this story in particular, you could interpret it literally, like, okay, it's some kind of weird government experiment, or again, you could interpret it as maybe this is all just some weird allegory for a school shooting, which oddly enough would make this story even more relevant than... This collection was published in the mid-2000s, like 2005, I think. I don't know if the story was written beforehand, but if that is what Joe Hill was going for, that makes this story even more relevant today.
Sure, absolutely. And there's also a lot of imagery, flying imagery, if you notice, right? His ability to fly. So again, maybe there's sort of this escape from this a very oppressive life that he lives. Like, the poor kid doesn't seem to live a very substantial or satisfying life. It seems that his parents have no interest in... the father and the girlfriend have like no interest in him. Yeah. The only attention he gets is from eating bugs and getting this kind of negative attention.
Yeah, I think even in the story, before the father realizes that he became a quote-unquote locust. Like, when he thinks he's just being lazy and laying in bed, he says, "Get out of there, you fucker," or something like that.
I also got a definite sort of apocalyptic kind of a Book of Revelations kind of feel from it too. This almost biblical, right? And that's one of the plagues, right? One of the plagues of God's plagues, right, was locusts, right? So again, I saw this maybe on a sort of an apocalyptic kind of something has happened. Like I said, I think they mentioned the government's doing these weird experiments out there. I mean, have they triggered the apocalypse in some ways?
Yeah, that's another interesting interpretation of it. So the next story in the collection is Abraham's Boys. This one I'm also discussing with Bill Burns. Do you want to explain this story?
Sure. Basically what you find out is that it's the sons of Abraham Van Helsing. And something has happened in Europe, and he's had to leave. You also find out that he ends up marrying Mina Harker, I believe. And something happens in Europe with Mina, and they have to leave. Him and his two sons have to leave. And so they've come over here, and the one son grew up more in Europe, so he hasn't really acclimated as well as the younger son, who seems to be much more interested in a sort of living an American lifestyle, you know? And so it's about sort of how do they live? Right, where obviously Van Helsing is obsessed with this idea of vampires, and he wants to protect his sons. He wants them to sort of understand the kind of shadow that they live under. And while the older son seems to understand that, the younger son seems to have nothing to do with that. He doesn't. I don't think he believes his father, and that he wants to be an American kid. He just wants to sort of to acclimatize to America, and that's where it goes from there. It's that sort of the dynamic between these three characters, and sort of what their fate is. By the end of the story.
But also, what I thought was really interesting about this story is how Van Helsing is basically the villain of the story. Like, he's a complete bastard to his sons.
Actually, this story reminded me so much of the Bill Paxton movie Frailty. And it reminded me so much of that. And it's a similar dynamic. We have a father who seems to have this sort of mania, has this sort of crazy idea, and he's trying to inculcate his sons into this belief, right? And you have these two boys that obviously look up to their father. They want to believe, right? We have this understanding in Western civilization of fathers being authority figures, and you listen to your father and you obey, And to me, that was the key theme of this story, is the idea of obedience. When do you start questioning the obedience towards your parents? If your parents are asking you to believe something that goes against reason, where do your allegiances lie? Do you say, no, that's my parents, I don't, I believe them, I know it sounds crazy, but I gotta believe them? Or do you step back and say, wait a minute, I have to start thinking for myself here. This doesn't make sense. This is crazy. I really saw that dynamic in the story. Actually, of the three stories I read, I think this is my favorite one, because I thought that dynamic was very interesting between parent and child. There's a couple of parts of the story which I guess we'll talk about, which I was a little confused about. But in the general, I thought that was real. I thought that was very interesting. And you also get the sense of different generations too. When this kind of reminded me a little bit of Martin, of George Romero's Martin, in the sense, even though the ending is kind of a reverse from the ending of Martin. But I also saw that too in the story. It's almost a clash of generations, of like sort of this idea of the old generation have these beliefs that are connected with the old world, and then you have the kids, right, whose their beliefs are very much connected to the new generation, right? This new world, this new society that they're living in. So I thought that clash was really interesting, even more so than the idea of vampires, or are they really real, whatever. Yeah. To me, the clash of those generations and the question of obedience, that to me was very interesting.
I like how the story, it starts out almost as a sequel to Bram Stoker's Dracula, but a way you could interpret it, maybe the events of Dracula never happened, maybe there were no vampires to begin with, and Van Helsing was just fucking crazy.
I mean, did he kill his wife? Did he kill Mina Harker?
Yeah.
And I thought the other thing that I guess the point that I thought was odd was at one point the older son is in Van Helsing's, his father's study, and they're not allowed to go in there. It's like an off-limits place. It's the father's own space. And something happens and they end up in there, right? They're playing or something, or the old younger brother screwing around, and he knocks something over. Something happens where they have to go in there. And the older brother is trying to clean up the mess that the younger brother made. And there's a picture, I think, of Mina Harker. right? And when he and the frame has broken, right? And the younger the older son sees that there's another picture behind the picture that is sort of projected out, right? And the picture behind it is a picture of Van Helsing killing a vampire, right? A woman, right? I thought that was really odd. Like, why would you put that picture behind it? And maybe does that play into that he is crazy? Like, why would you keep a picture like that, especially next to a picture of your deceased wife? You know what I mean? Like, I thought that was a really strange moment there. And again, maybe gives insight into Van Helsing's real psyche.
Yeah.
You know, what's really going on. Why would you hide that? You know, a lot of times in literature, when people hide things, it also reflects the sort of what's going on within them that they're not revealing to, you know, the public in some ways. So I thought that was an odd little moment where you're like, where I started thinking to myself, wait a minute, you know, is this fight with vampires a real thing, or is this just some mania that he's going through and an excuse to kill people?
Van Helsing, in so many different adaptations of Dracula, he's usually portrayed as one of the protagonists of that story. But to be honest, though, if you read the original book, Van Helsing was always kind of a dickhead. Like, honestly, the only interpretation of the character that I could think of who wasn't a dick was Peter Cushing's version of Van Helsing from the Hammer films.
Very much so, yeah. Edward von Sloan, right, in the original Dracula.
Yeah.
Was kind of
Anthony Hopkins.
Right, was a lunatic, right, in Bram Stoker's Dracula. And then it's interesting that in Dracula's Daughter and also in Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, right, aren't they both charged? With murder, right? They're both charged with murder in both of those movies. That they, you know, obviously the officials don't believe that this is, you know, an actual vampire, you know, and they're charged with murder because they've killed somebody, you know. And again, this also, I think, also connects a little bit into George Romero's Martin, where you wonder, is this kid really a vampire? He thinks he's a vampire, or is he just a serial killer? And then how do you deal with that? Like, how does one deal with that? Like, do you kill the monster, or do you understand and have sympathy for a monster that can't stop himself in some ways because it's mentally, you know, there's something mentally wrong with them.
But yeah, this was a great story. This definitely is one of my favorite stories in this particular collection.
And again, there's something that they don't say explicitly. Something happened in Europe with Mina. And again, is it that did Van Helsing kill her? Right? Think in some ways, did his mania cause him to think she was a vampire, or did she have that? Because I mean, in the original Dracula, right, she sucks Dracula's blood, right? So does that taint still? Does that drive Van Helsing crazy? He marries this woman, and he knows that within her blood is the blood of his greatest enemy. Mm-hmm. Does that drive him over the edge? Does that make him like he becomes obsessive to the point of having to kill Mina?
Yeah, that's another interesting way to interpret it, is like, okay, maybe there never was a Dracula and he was just crazy, or maybe just the experience of going up against this thing, this vampire, something that humans could probably just begin to comprehend, drove him fucking crazy. Which, of course, is a connection you can make to Lovecraft, this idea of having encounters with these beings that are beyond human understanding, driving the protagonist insane.
Yeah, like a post-traumatic existential stress disorder or something that you can't go back to the way you were beforehand. You know, and I think they actually mentioned Jonathan Harker too, I believe, right?
Yes.
They say something
happened to him, and then Van Helsing married Mina.
Right. Which again, but you get why did they marry? Like, because Van Helsing is so much older than her. Was it the fact that they went through this trauma together, and maybe they couldn't connect with anybody else because nobody else really that they know went through this? Did he force her to marry her? You know, so again, one of the things I really like about this story is the lack of details. I know that might sound weird, but I think it opens it up to so many different ways of looking at it, so many different perspectives, and trying to figure out, like, why do the characters do the things they do in the story. To me, that's always so much fun. It's always one of the best things about literature is thinking about those things.
Now, the story was adapted into a short film in 2009, and apparently they are working on a feature-length adaptation of this story from director Natasha Kermany. I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right.
So the next story in the collection is Better Than Home, and I'm once again joined by Jeremy. So what do you think of this story?
It was a sweet, heartwarming story. I was actually surprised that it really wasn't horror, but, it was a nice story.
I honestly think it was one of the best of the collection, if we're being honest. And what I really liked about it was, I don't know, in some ways I kind of related to, like, the main character in the sense that, okay, so I'm getting a little personal here, but growing up I had Asperger's, that's how you pronounce it, right? Yeah. Like, and that is sort of on the autism spectrum. And let's just say growing up I also had some behavioral problems, and there were certain adults that didn't really know how to handle my issues, so I kind of related to the main character of the story in that regard. But basically the story's about this young kid, this autistic kid whose father is a professional baseball player, and basically as the story goes on you kind of get the sense that his father's really the only one who really knows how to handle him and really knows how to talk to him, whereas his mother and his aunt really don't know how to handle him.
Yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Yeah. Like, it's very short, but it's very sweet, very heartwarming, and again, it's not a horror story, so it kind of stands out from the other stories in the collection. So, any closing thoughts on this story?
It's a good story, very heartfelt and heartwarming, and, the main character, he has a lot of phobias, like about getting E. coli from the Wendy's hamburgers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's very sympathetic.
So, the next story in the collection is The Black Phone, and I'm once again joined by Chris to talk about this story. The Black Phone is probably now the most famous story in the collection because it was recently adapted into the film of the same name, which was a freaking amazing movie. I actually think The Black Phone might be the best mainstream horror film to come out last year. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
I would. One of the best movies to come out in a long time.
But basically, the premise of The Black Phone, the story, is it's about a young boy who is abducted by a child murderer, and he's being locked up in the killer's basement, and what happens is there's this phone on the wall, which is disconnected, yet he can hear it ring. And essentially, the story is about the ghost of the children that this killer previously murdered, trying to help the main character and give him clues on how to escape. That's the basic premise of The Black Phone, but what do you think of this story?
I thought it was really interesting because in the story, this killer is portrayed by this, fat, grotesquely fat guy with, a Hawaiian shirt.
You could tell Joe Hill was definitely basing him off John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
Especially because, isn't he a clown in the story? I know he's a clown in the movie, but I don't know if he was... I don't remember if he was a clown in the story.
I think that is talked about.
There's also a subplot about his sister trying to find him, because it's revealed in the story that his sister has some kind of psychic abilities. Right. Now, I don't know if you want to count this as being connected to Joe Hill's father's fictional universe, but if you wanted to set this within the same universe or multiverse as his father's Stephen King stories, maybe you could say his sister is a Shiner.
You could say that, yeah. I mean, in the story, you don't really get too much. You, hear about her, like dealing with tarot cards and, some stuff. But, and also in the story, she's, 3 years older, where in the movie, she's younger. But, in the story, you don't get too much. In the movie, you really find out more about that stuff.
But yeah, I recommend the story. The movie, though, the movie expands upon a lot of things because the story isn't that long, but the movie, I was just blown the fuck away by the movie. I really was. The movie, it's the same premise as the story, but again, it expands a lot of things, and another thing I really liked about the movie, in the short story, they didn't really touch on the main character's parents that much. Right. I know in the short story, his mother's still alive, whereas in the movie, the mother's dead, but in the movie, the father is an abusive prick. He's a piece of shit, yet the movie is so well written that there are times where you actually do feel sorry for this guy, and the movie does really humanize the character of their father,
Right.
who, again, he technically should be looked at as a villain, yet he's a very three-dimensional character.
Which I gotta say, that scene where the father is just beating the shit out of the younger sister is one of the most uncomfortable scenes I've seen in a recent film. And the movie really does expand the role of the main character's sister to a point where both the brother and sister are essentially dual protagonists in the story, and it's actually a great coming-of-age movie. And Ethan Hawke plays one of the best villains in a recent horror film in that movie. Different than his counterpart in the short story, but still a very chilling performance.
And also, you do get to learn more about like the characters, about the killer's brother. You know, you have these coke addict brother, which is also talked about in the story.
Yeah.
Like in the story, you don't learn too much about him. You just know that he's on coke, and then he comes down to the basement and he sees this kid. He's like, holy shit! I knew that he was hiding something from me. I'm gonna save you. And then you have the killer come with with an axe and just takes it right to his brother's head.
Yeah.
Like, look what you made me do.
He was an idiot, but he was my idiot.
Yes.
I think the movie does this a little more than the short story, but you get these subtle hints of what the killer's backstory might be, but it never fully explains it.
And also in the movie, you get this whole new persona with this mask that he wears. So basically, he wears this mask, and he's able to take half of it off that has like a smiley face and a frowny face. And basically, in the movie, you get to see his emotions. Like, he basically knows how the kid's gonna act based on what like mask he's gonna put on, which is very interesting.
Now, apparently there are talks of doing a sequel to The Black Phone, and I have no idea how the fuck that's gonna work, but I guess we'll wait and see.
I definitely recommend The Black Phone. I think it's definitely one of the best stories in the collection, and if you haven't, definitely check out the movie as well. The next story in the collection is called In the Rundown, and basically this is about this video store clerk who is kind of an asshole. You find out in the story that he does have trouble reading, and you get the idea that him being an asshole to other people is kind of a defense mechanism because he's so embarrassed by his learning disability. But basically, he ends up getting into a fight with a coworker and actually physically threatens her, so he gets fired. So after this, he's all pissed off, and he goes on a walk, and he stumbles upon some kind of crime scene. That's really all I can say about the story without giving too much away. But even by the end of the story, it's actually very ambiguous what actually ends up happening. But yeah, this was a decent story. Definitely not one of my favorites in the collection, but it wasn't bad either. I also think it's interesting that this is set at a video store in the early 2000s, because even though video stores at that time were kinda still going strong, they were kind of on their way out too at this point, so it's almost like you're seeing a story set during the last years of the video store. So, for this section of the video, I'm discussing the short story The Cape from 20th Century Ghosts, and I'm once again joined by Chris. Yes. You might notice we're in a slightly different location than where we recorded our reviews of Pop Art and The Black Phone, but The Cape, what do you think of this story?
I really enjoyed The Cape. I mean, you know, it started off with this kid who was running around with this little blanket and pretending it was like a superhero cape. Which I think as kids we all kind of did.
Oh, yeah,
Some of us as adults even maybe.
Basically there's an accident where the kid who's pretending to be a superhero jumps out of a tree, but for a brief period it almost looks like he's flying. Yeah. His brother witnesses this, but he does fall and has to go to the hospital, but then the brother tries it, and the brother gets, royally fucked up from it. It doesn't work for him. Yeah. But as the years go by, they start to kind of drift apart, the two brothers, but the one brother Like, he does, like, he becomes very successful, he becomes a doctor, whereas the other brother, the brother who, as a kid, was pretending to be a superhero, basically becomes a bit of a, I hate to use this term, but kind of a loser.
Yeah.
Although he does seem to have better luck with girls than his brother does. What happens is, as an adult, this kid finds the cape again, and puts it on, and it works. He can fly. And basically the whole story is a twist on the superhero genre. Right. But let's just say things do not go in the direction you might be expecting. Basically, let's just say he doesn't use his newfound powers for good.
Right.
And I remember you compared this to the recent horror film. Well, I don't know how recent it is. It was a few years ago, but Brightburn, which was kind of a horror take on the whole Superman story.
Yep. Yeah, so basically this kid, when he had the accident all those years ago, he suffered like brain damage, and he always did poorly in school, so he was seen as an outcast. Like, his mother saw him as not really being that bright. Yeah. And so all these years later, like, he gets out on his own, but he struggles with like everyday stuff. Mm-hmm. And then he meets up with this girl, and they're doing pretty good for a while, but then, things happen and they break up.
Yeah.
And he's really disappointed. So he actually, as like an adult, a young adult, he moves back with his mom. And like, the mom's not really surprised about this. She's unhappy about it, but she lets him in. And that's where he finds the cape again. And he puts it on, and he's able to do all these powers again. He's able to fly, and possibly having some superhuman strength.
Yeah,
where he, like, tackles a bear or something. Right?
Well, that's not in the short story. That's in the comic.
In the comics, right. Yeah. So there's also comics that later explore more stuff with it. So with the story, so he gets all these powers, and like I said, him and his girlfriend have broken up. He's flying, he goes to her apartment, he sees her, and pretty much he just, like, kind of invites himself in, takes her, and they're flying for a little bit. Things seem kind of cool, and then he decides to take her up and just basically drop her to her death.
Yeah, that was like because I was like, when I was reading the story, I was kind of expecting kind of an uplifting ending, and like when I saw that, I was like, oh, yeah, this is, he's kind of a fucking bastard. Yeah, but no, it's a really, really good story, and like you pointed out, there was a comic book series based on this short story. Now, did Joe Hill write the comics as well? Or was it another writer who wrote the comics?
It was another writer who wrote the comics. And so, but with the comics, it definitely expands on that. So in the comics, basically, he goes after his brother, thinking that he talked her into breaking up with him. And then he also goes after his mom, and also, later on, he goes after some friends that used to bully him as a kid. So,
and you said there was also a prequel comic that explains where the cape came from?
So that one was called 1969, and that was based off when his father originally got the cape in Vietnam.
And then the movie Brightburn. Brightburn was really meant to be almost like a horror take on the Superman story, which this is kind of a horror take on the Superman story too. I don't know if Brightburn was maybe inspired by this story or not, but they are very similar. The next story in the collection is called Last Breath, and basically this is about this family who come to this museum, and at the museum are all these glass jars with headphones, and contained in the jars are apparently people's final breaths, like the last breath they took before they died, and the father and son are completely enamored with this, but the mother is like, what the hell is wrong with you two? This is clearly a scam, but I really can't say too much else about the story without giving it away, but this was a really good story. It's very creepy, but also darkly humorous as well, and very, very Bradbury-esque. The next story in the collection is called Deadwood, and this one is almost not properly a story. I guess you could say it's sort of a prose poem. It's only 2 pages long, and there really isn't a plot or characters in it. It's more just this idea. The idea is, what if trees have souls, and what if a tree that's been cut down can leave behind a ghost? I don't really have a whole lot to say about it because, again, it's only 2 pages. It's almost not really much of a story, but it is creepy and almost like Edgar Allan Poe-esque in a way. But, again, it's not bad, but there's just not a whole lot to say about this one. The next story in the collection is called Widow's Breakfast, and this was an excellent story. It's not a horror story, it's more of this short little drama about kindness. It's set during the Great Depression, and it's about this man who has no job and no home, and he's living as a vagabond, and he ends up coming to the home of this recently widowed woman, and she gives him breakfast, and new clothes to wear, and a new pair of shoes. And again, it's really just a story about the importance of human kindness and showing compassion to your fellow man, especially in times of trouble like the Great Depression. Again, it's not a horror story, it's just a really good story about human compassion.
Alright, so for the next story in the collection, I'm once again joined by Bill Burns, and we're discussing Bobby Conroy Comes Back from the Dead. And basically, this is about this guy, he's sort of a failed comedian, like, he tried to make it in the field and it didn't really work out for him. He returns home, gets a job as a substitute teacher, and is kind of down on his luck. But he ends up getting work as an extra on this movie set, and on the set of this movie, he runs into his old high school sweetheart. And really, it's sort of a bittersweet love story about this guy reconnecting with his old girlfriend, but also kind of having to accept that his old girlfriend may have moved on now. And what's interesting about this story is the movie set they're on is actually the set of the original Dawn of the Dead, and both George Romero and Tom Savini are characters in this story. What do you think of this one?
Well, to be honest, I thought the only interesting aspect of this story was being on the set of the Dawn of the Dead set. I thought the story was kind of cliched, to be honest.
Okay.
Like coming back, and because and it's funny because the way you described it, the way you put it at the end, because it seems like they're going to get back together, and that's his, and the son that she has is his son. So there isn't that redeeming. He doesn't have to do that. That's what I was disappointed in. You know what I mean? Like, do you understand what I mean? It was I think I would have preferred if he sort of comes to a realization that sometimes things just go, things end sometimes, and they, But I guess that would go against Dawn of the Dead because, like, in Dawn of the Dead, things don't end, right? Because if you think you're dead, you come back, right? And so, but I guess, again, like I said, I like the idea of them being on this set of this, especially for horror fans, this iconic movie. But I thought the story itself, with the love story and him coming back, I thought that was kind of cliche, to be honest. This was, out of the 3 stories I read, this is my least favorite.
Okay, that's fair enough. I like the story a lot, personally, but I don't know if maybe just simply because it's set during the making of Dawn of the Dead, if I have a bias towards it or not. But I don't mind these kinds of stories, these kinds of, as I described it, a bittersweet love story. I don't really mind these kinds of stories, so yeah, I dug the story personally.
I know. I thought, like, here's, like, they haven't seen each other for so long. The woman marries this other guy. They have a child together, but you're not sure. Like, there's this sort of subtle undertones that maybe this child is actually Bobby's, right? And they go out to lunch. The husband meets with them, and so they've been together for maybe 3 hours, and like she's already like ready to leave her husband, and like this. I was like, whoa, man, that's talk about a weak marriage. But that's like the end when they all all 3 of them claps together and they're all hugging on the bed. I was like, again, I kind of thought that was kind of corny, to be honest.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. I don't know. I will say the main character, Bobby Conroy, is a bit of a dickhead. The way he judges his ex-girlfriend's new husband, because the new husband doesn't seem like a bad guy at all.
Not at all. He doesn't say anything. He seems. Think about it. He invites him to lunch with them. Like, he could have been like, I don't have anything to do with him. Like, he could even said to the wife, like, I'm angry about this. What are you doing with your old boyfriend? But no, he seems like I said, I mean, maybe maybe not the most intelligent guy, but he seems like a good guy. And I think that was bothered me too. Like, it's not like this guy's a jerk and you can say like, oh, okay, I hope she leaves him to go back with Bobby. But he seems like a really nice guy. Like, he takes care of them. He works hard, right? They have a business or something together. And again, it's like, I agree. I think Bobby was kind of a little bit of a jerk like that. Like, and he obviously he was intelligent enough to see that there were little stresses in their marriage, and he pushes at those stresses. And I think that's kind of like, it's kind of a jerk move,
Kind of predatory too.
Right? Actually. Yeah, that's a good point. I would agree with that.
I mean, yeah, it's not a perfect story, but I enjoyed it personally. My one big disappointment with this story, the fact that it's set on the set of Dawn of the Dead. I wished Joe Hill would have incorporated other actors who are from Dawn of the Dead as characters in this short story. Like, it would have been cool to see Ken Foree make an appearance, or what the hell was the name of the actress who played Fran?
Galen Ross?
Galen Ross, yeah.
Right. I think it'd be really cool, like, if Galen Ross would have gave the female character advice or something, because she's a strong woman, in the film. But yeah, that would have been cool. I would have liked, like I said, I would have, that was the thing I really liked about the story. So, like, if they had put more of that in, I think I would have liked it more. Because, like I said, I thought the love story and the relationship in the story was kind of, like I said, kind of like corny, kind of like you've seen it a lot in other stories or other TV or movies.
But one thing I want to point out about Joe Hill making Tom Savini a character in this story, Joe Hill, when he was a kid, played Billy in Creepshow, and apparently on the set of Creepshow, he became very close with Tom Savini. I don't know if you saw, they recently adapted Joe Hill's comic book series Lock and Key for Netflix, and Tom Savini makes a cameo in the first season of Lock and Key.
Oh, that's cool. No, I did not know that. But again, the way they were used in the story, I thought were very good. I thought the way Romero was so like self-effacing, like he seemed like such a cool guy. You know what I mean? Like, he wasn't being like, I'm the director and everything. He was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, he seemed like really cool, and he seemed like, just was able to so even to these people who were extras, who obviously on the sort of cinema hierarchy, extras aren't exactly that high, and certainly not as high as a director. Right, but it seemed from the story itself that George Romero really made these people feel important, made them feel like they were significant, and that we're not below anybody.
So these 3 stories I showed you, they're the only things you've read so far from Joe Hill, right?
That is it, yes.
How do you think his writing style compares to that of his father, Stephen King?
I think it's very close. I think I see a lot of his father, which obviously would make sense, But again, one of the things that I going back to the Abraham son story, I think that would be very interesting if he did more stuff with this idea of fathers and sons, parents and children. I mean, I wonder if he could fall back on, because from what I understand is that, for a while, his father wasn't exactly the nicest guy. He had an alcohol problem, right? He based a lot of Jack Torrance, right, on himself. I wonder if that would be an interesting kind of thing, see him go more in that direction of sort of, fathers and sons, and, what kind of insights he could give to having such a famous father, like, did he feel, in the shadow of his father, did he feel he had to be more, obey even more because his father was famous, So to me, I thought that would be an interesting, that aspect of it could be really interesting to add to his writing.
The next story contained in the collection is My Father's Mask, and this story was freaking weird, man. This was really, really weird. And don't get me wrong, I loved it. I thought it was an excellent story, but honestly, I couldn't tell you thing one of what this story is actually about. And honestly, the best way I could describe this story, it's like if Neil Gaiman and David Lynch did a Twilight Zone episode. Basically, the story is about this kid who goes on a weekend trip with his mother and father to this lake house that was owned by his grandfather who recently died. Now, the mother has this game that she sometimes plays with him where she comes up with these completely fictional scenarios and gets him to play along with them. This one scenario she comes up with is that they're being pursued by these people called the card-playing people who don't like the lives that they're currently living and want to take them away from their current lives. Now, obviously the scenario is completely made up, but when they get to the lake house, they find these masks, and the mother tells her son that they have to wear the masks the whole time that they're there. And the boy's father starts acting really, really weird when he puts on his mask, and eventually they tell him to go out into the woods to collect wood, and then he runs into this boy with angel wings riding his bike through the woods, and this really freaks him out, and then he comes across this boy and girl about his age, and they tell him, oh, come with us, and they hide out in this little tree house and start playing cards, and the boy and girl tell him that they'll protect him from the boy with angel wings. Again, it's a really, really weird story, and even the way I'm describing it now doesn't even begin to do it justice. And again, I like the story a lot, but I'm also kind of struggling to figure out what the hell is actually going on in this story. Now, this story was obviously written years before this movie, but there's a lot of aspects of this story that reminded me a lot of the recent Ari Aster film, Beau is Afraid. I'll admit, I didn't really care for that movie that much, but there were a lot of visuals and even some thematic elements from that movie that really came to mind when I was reading this story. The next story in the collection is called Voluntary Committal, and this one is actually more of a novella, or at least it's close to novella length. But this was a really good one. Basically, it's about this guy named Nolan whose mentally challenged younger brother Morris recently disappeared from the psychiatric hospital where he's been living for several years. But most of the story is actually a flashback to when they were both kids, and Morris used to build these huge, elaborate forts from cardboard boxes and other materials. But it turns out that these forts may have opened gateways to other worlds. But most of the story focuses on this incident where one of Nolan's friends crawled into Morris's fort and never came out. But again, this was a really good story and very, very creepy. Like, before the friend ends up disappearing into the fort, he talks about how he hears somebody in the fort with him. Meanwhile, Nolan and his brother are both outside the fort at the time. And also, there's that song, The Ants Go Marching 2 by 2, Hurrah, Hurrah. That song is playing during this whole scene, and the younger brother even says he has no idea where the music is actually coming from, but somehow the music is coming out of the fort. It's just so freaking creepy. Now, this story also reminded me a lot of a short story by Joe Hill's father, Stephen King, called Mrs. Todd's Shortcut. Now, in speaking of Stephen King, a lot of Stephen King's books and short stories take place in either the same universe or the same multiverse, and Joe Hill being Stephen King's son, a lot of people think that his stories tie into the Stephen King multiverse, and I'm not sure if I buy that for all of his stories, but this story I could totally buy as being somehow connected to Stephen King's Dark Tower series, especially with the idea of gateways to other worlds. But yeah, highly recommend Voluntary Committal. So, the final story contained in the collection is Scheherazade's Typewriter, and I'm sure I butchered that name. Now, the name Scheherazade, I think, is a reference to Arabian Nights. Now, the story is actually not listed on the table of contents. It's actually sort of a bonus hidden story hidden within the acknowledgement section of the book, which I thought was really cool. It reminded me of when some bands include hidden tracks on the last songs of certain albums. But basically, the story is about this woman whose father recently died, and when he was alive, he always wanted to be a famous writer, but when he was younger, he couldn't get anything published, and as he got older, he basically kind of gave up on his dreams. But what happens is, after he dies, his typewriter just comes to life and starts typing out all these stories on its own, as if his ghost is possessing the typewriter. So the typewriter just starts churning out all these stories, and what's cool about it is when it describes the stories, you realize that it's the stories that we just read in the collection, and this story almost works as a wraparound story for the entire collection. Clive Barker actually did something similar with his Books of Blood series, where the first story in the first volume of Books of Blood was about this man who was attacked by ghosts, and the ghosts carve words into his body, and these words are stories, and you realize these stories are the stories that you'll be reading throughout the 6 volumes of Books of Blood. But yeah, Scheherazade's Typewriter is a decent little story, and it's a really good cap-off to the entire collection. But yeah, 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill I thought was a really good short story collection, and what I really liked about it is the stories in here are actually very versatile, and the collection really does run the gamut of several different genres, from horror to black comedy to fantasy to drama. And you can also see several different influences on the stories in this collection. Obviously, you can see an influence of Joe Hill's father on some of the stories in here, especially The Black Phone and Voluntary Committal. But then there's also a real Neil Gaiman influence on stories like Pop Art and My Father's Mask, and My Father's Mask is also very Lynchian. Last Breath feels very Ray Bradbury, but then The Cape feels very Alan Moore inspired, and The Widow's Breakfast feels very John Steinbeck. So again, Joe Hill really does run the gamut of several different influences here. But again, it's a very good short story collection. So that was my review of 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill, and bye.